Everyone knows you're not a real YouTube reviewer until you tried your hand at a Halloween special. Unfortunately for me, I'm a bit of a wimp. Seriously, I can count the number of horror games I've beaten on one hand. We have Dead Space, Dominium, of course a couple of the Resident Evil games, and for me personally, I have Saw here. What can I say? I know it's not that great of a game, but the movies are a guilty pleasure for me.
I mean, I love games with horror elements. The Parasite Eve series, Half-Life, Onimusha, Splatterhouse, Castlevania, the Souls games. Hell, one of my favorite games of all times is The Last of Us, which in my opinion drifts more towards stealth than horror, but the elements are very clearly there all the same. I bring all of this up because I'm sure many people will read the title of this video and think, Katherine isn't a horror game. And to that I say, yeah, well, it's about as close as I can get. While not necessarily a part of the horror genre, the game certainly has elements of it. And it's a game I enjoy a great deal, so I'm doing it. Besides, the game can be downright terrifying after all. What could possibly be scarier to a man than commitment? Okay, just cut to the video. When you first start the game, you might be a little bit weirded out because Katherine uses a framing device called the Golden Playhouse. This framing device seems to hint at more possible games in the series, and I really wish Atlas would go through with that. If the whole Golden Playhouse setup throws you off, don't worry, you don't really have to deal with it except for at the very beginning of the game and at the very end. That being said, let's get to the meat of the story. Katherine follows a man in his mid-30s named Vincent, who is struggling with the pressures adult life is putting on him. He has a new tech job and a longtime girlfriend who's pressuring him into a marriage he isn't sure he's ready for. As fate would have it, a new girl wanders into the bar he frequents and, well, one thing leads to another, causing Vincent to become extremely conflicted about which girl he should be with. The carefree and fun-loving blonde who has a loose definition of commitment, or stable but motherly longtime girlfriend. Things become all the more difficult for him, however, when his infidelity leads him to being trapped in a nightmare where he's forced to climb a tower of blocks, and if he should fail, he will die in the real world. He comes to find out that this curse isn't just affecting him, but many of the other men in town as well, which leads to a rather compelling mystery story on the side. To spoil Katherine's plot would be a huge disservice, as the story is the game's main focus, even more so than the stellar puzzle mechanics that we'll get into later. Because of that, I'm hesitant to do a full story breakdown and analysis, and instead we'll give a quick breakdown of what I feel does and does not work in terms of the game's storytelling. Because if I'm being honest, it's a bit of a mixed bag. First and foremost, the game uses a rather odd gimmick of both of the girls in the game being named Katherine, one with a C and one with a K, presumably so that they could save on voice acting and make the story needlessly confusing at points. In order to make discussion of the story less perplexing in this review, I'm going to attempt to simplify things by calling this woman C, this woman K, and only say Katherine fully when I'm talking about the game itself. The fact that Katherine's story primarily focuses around an adult relationship and the struggles of infidelity was one of the key focuses that made me interested in the game, as it's not a topic we see covered in games very often. There are very good reasons for that, primarily that there's no good way of implementing gameplay around such a plot, which is something even Katherine doesn't have an answer for since the story and gameplay are so far removed from one another. But even so, I'm surprised it doesn't come up more often even as a subplot in mature story-driven titles. Though I can't say that Katherine handles this topic delicately, mostly because the game doesn't exactly represent C and K on an even level, which is something I lament despite understanding the reasoning for it. The game immediately paints K as nagging and motherly, only showing the negative sides of her personality, while by contrast, C is shown only as bubbly and, well, let's just call it out for what it is and say sexy. The game sets the situation up in a highly manipulative way to try and make the player, while filling Vincent's shoes, gravitate towards C. This makes sense because without that attraction, the game's story would have no conflict. But I wish that as the story progressed, they would have slowly shown how K was a good girlfriend as well, because that could have created a much more powerful guilt in the player, as well as made both ending options more satisfying. As it currently stands, we have a scene where K brings Vincent cake, which is a nice gesture, but the effects aren't positive because it immediately follows a moment where Vincent is nearly caught in bed with C a few moments prior. It really just comes down to me wishing that they'd done more with the premise, because it wouldn't have taken all that much effort to make the romance that much more interesting on both sides. Speaking of the romance, let's discuss how the game decides which girl you'll end up with, if any. During the game's real-life bar sequences, you will often get text messages from both C and K, and how you respond to these messages, as well as how you respond to specific questions presented to you during the nightmares, will determine what ending you will end up getting. Don't let the game fool you into thinking that your choices impact impact the story in a large way beyond that, because they unfortunately do not. In fact, in an odd way, the very fact that you are given so many decisions that don't affect anything makes the storytelling feel rather awkward and clunky at times. For example, about 3/4 of the way through the game, I had completely maxed out the chaos side of the decision meter, and yet Vincent still spouts dialogue insisting he wants to remain with K as opposed to leading towards C, which is the actual ending I was going for and ended up getting anyway. Katherine is telling you a story, not letting you make a story, which is perfectly fine. Many games before and since have done this. I just feel it was important to state so that people know what they are actually getting. I generally go into a spiel here about how choice affects a gamer's experience and how the illusion of choice is oftentimes more important than the choices themselves, but even on my fairly new channel, I've made that well-trodden ground. Suffice it to say, Katherine is really banking on you being so entranced by its tale of confused love that you don't realize how little involvement you have in it. Setting aside the romance, the game has a supernatural mystery as a key part of its plot as well. Obviously, the dreams the men in the game are going through is being caused by something, and piecing together the reasons why, as well as the backstories of the many patrons at the Stray Sheep bar, is incredibly interesting and satisfying. Your interactions with these other patrons, both in Vincent's dreams and outside of it, can determine who lives and dies throughout the story as well, which gives even more incentive to be personable. I don't want to spoil anything else when it comes to the story, but I will leave you with a personal anecdote that may persuade you.
Now, I didn't buy Katherine at launch, but it's a game I've been following for some time before that. Once I finally got my hands on it, I called up my friend Andrew to come check out the game with me, and long story short, we ended up beating it in one sitting. We were up until 7 a.m. and I remember we were just so groggy. We got stuck on the last boss and just had to keep pushing forward anyway because we had to know how the game ended. We ended up getting the C ending that night, and even then, we were satisfied, but we wanted to start the game over immediately to start trying to get the K ending.
I really do feel that despite the issues with Katherine's story, it is one worth experiencing. Well, now that we've got that taken care of, let's move on to presentation. Katherine's story is far more effective than it otherwise would have been thanks to some stellar vocal performances and great directing. I didn't feel that a single voice was out of place, and the conversational tones and cast chemistry were spot on, which, considering the game's story sections play out more like an anime than a game in the first place, is a very good thing. The use of subtlety in most of the conversations makes the scenes that do go over the top in the signature anime style all the more effective. It's also interesting to note that the over-the-top expressions and moments only happen with Vincent himself, meaning that the over-exaggerated moments are more a reflection of what the character is feeling than what is going on in the real world. Speaking of the world, it is also lovingly crafted and full of detail. Though, to be fair, the game only has one interactive environment, so anything less would be inexcusable. Since the entirety of the real-world scenes take place in a bar, I'm glad that they went the extra mile and gave a bunch of trivia about alcohol as you play. It was a fascinating addition that made the experience feel all the more complete. The game's soundtrack is a rather eclectic mix of genres, from hip-hop to orchestral, but easily the most unique aspect of the game's score is a remix of classic musical pieces for use during the game's puzzle sections. All of the music is incredibly good, being both well composed and arranged when applicable. In fact, I actually enjoy the game's music even more outside of the game, where I was actually granted the opportunity to enjoy it on a deeper level, without the distraction of the plot or frantic gameplay getting in the way. Whether or not you enjoy the aesthetic will rely on how you feel about the anime style as a whole, but there's no denying that everything was skillfully rendered and that the soundtrack is a feast for the ears. While Katherine is primarily a story-focused experience, the gameplay in the nightmare sections is incredibly engaging. It's a bit hard to really go in depth when discussing the puzzle mechanics, as evidenced by the fact that the game is still giving you relevant pointers by the time you reach the last few stages. It's not just block placement, but block composition that you must worry about, as there are many types with different abilities. Some are traps that can kill you if you stand on them too long. Others crumble beneath your feet and become unstable after a certain number of steps. Others turn into ticking time bombs, etc. There are multiple ways to scale the tower, and finding the solution to these puzzles was always a rewarding, albeit sometimes frustrating experience, especially during the boss battles. Said boss battles require you to scale the tower of blocks, but faster, and while avoiding the devastating and sometimes infuriatingly cheap attacks of the monstrosities that chase you. I know I said I didn't want to spoil things, but for the sake of showing how strange this game is, I'd just like to point out that one of the bosses is a chainsaw-wielding baby, and another is this manifestation of Vincent and C's first time having anal sex. Yeah, I swear I'm not kidding. What's even more messed up is that this is actually plot relevant. But anyway, let's get back on track. Not everything about the puzzle mechanics are perfect, however. Oftentimes, especially during boss fights, the camera will pull out so far from the action that it's hard for you to tell what is going on, which led to a lot of guesswork in those moments on my playthrough. Luckily, the game does come with an undo button that allows you to take back a few block pushes, so not all is lost, but still an annoying inconvenience. The game also becomes unwieldy when you are scaling the outside of blocks. Whenever you reach the backside of a structure, your controls become reversed, which in the heat of the moment can potentially cause your death. This is an issue that very rarely comes up because you are rarely required to climb on the back of the tower, but it's an issue nonetheless. Despite a few bouts of cheapness and some rare gameplay annoyances, actually completing the puzzles is incredibly satisfying and addicting. While there are many locations in the tower where I would get stuck for prolonged periods of time, I'd always want to push forward to be rewarded with another story segment. There are also a couple of bonus challenge modes that allow you to climb more of these towers, and can potentially unlock a secret ending, though supposedly the final stage in this bonus section is bugged and unwinnable, at least when you're playing single player. There seem to be conflicting accounts as to whether or not this is true, and some other accounts stating that it depends on which region of the game you have. If I'm being honest though, it's not something I fussed with, as I was more than satisfied with the main game's endings as they were. In addition, if you love the block puzzles but don't feel you were getting enough during the main story and bonus content, there's an additional minigame called Rapunzel that lets you take on even more block puzzles, but instead of a time limit, it gives you a move limit. This adds a substantial amount of gameplay, and the small tweaks to the rules felt refreshing, rewarding slower and more thoughtful play compared to the frantic and impulsive play that the main tower exemplifies.
If nothing else, Katherine is an extremely unique game that I could recommend to both fans of anime and fans of puzzle games. The storyline alone is worth experiencing at least once just because of how weird things get, and the gameplay can be extremely satisfying once you figure out how the block puzzles work. Anyway, thank you all for watching. This is Stiles with a rather weak Halloween special, wishing all of you guys a happy Halloween, and I hope you all have a good day.
Alright, my first holiday-themed video, and I feel it turned out pretty decently, despite all the hurdles I had to overcome. If you feel like watching another video of mine that sort of fits the thriller vibe, you can check out my review of Fahrenheit, also known as Indigo Prophecy. Or if you're looking to see something more recent, you can check out Stiles' series synopsis of Final Fantasy II. Thanks again for watching, and have a good day!